My favourite thing about choreographed combat is the sheer variety of things you can do with it, including selling us on both how these characters will be BFFs, but these characters will just never get along. Today's topic is Pacific Rim, and there are two scenes we're going to talk about: finding Raleigh a drift partner and Raleigh versus Chuck Hansen. In one, we learn how close two people can be. In the other, we see there's never going to be any understanding. My name is Jill Bearup, and I make videos about screen and stage combat, aka all that fake fighting in movies. Stage combat is basically the only hobby I have that lets me get out in the fresh air, and even then, only sometimes. My second favourite thing about stage combat, if you were wondering, is that the narrative controls the outcome, which is great for me because I'm kind of a wuss, and so it's nice to be able to win sometimes, even if it's totally fake. Pacific Rim is the 2013 giant mecha punching giant monsters movie that I loved more than I really expected to, even though I am a fan of people pretending to punch each other in creative ways. Look at these crazy kids and their giant robots that they pilot through the power of togetherness and sharing and whatnot. The deeper the bond, the better you fight. The plot revolves around the team trying to fight the monsters that appear from under the Pacific Ocean and then also seal up the interdimensional breach that means that they keep on coming. So there are lots of giant monsters fighting giant robots, but I've always been a sucker for the more human scale fights. The setup for the first one is that Stacker Pentecost has decided he needs Raleigh for the whole saving the world thing, which means that Raleigh is going to need a drift partner. Raleigh is not exactly a maverick, but he is...
You're unpredictable. You have a habit of deviating from standard combat techniques. You take risks to endanger yourself and your crew.
Yeah, that.
I don't think you're the right man for this mission.
Well, that was blunt.
Wow. Thank you for your honesty.
And that, for those of us expecting standard action film archetypes, was unexpected. Though I guess him speaking to Mako in Japanese when he gets off the helicopter is possibly our first hint of this slight unexpectedness in Raleigh's character. I think most of the reason for Chuck Hansen existing in this film is to provide a contrast to Raleigh. Chuck is a jerk and we dislike him, whereas Raleigh is not. When we first see Raleigh in the movie, he's an enthusiastic puppy with really great abs. The enthusiasm does not persist past the death of his brother, though, and by this point in the film, he's mostly thoughtful. Which is going to be important because it turns out that the chaps that Mako has picked out for him to potentially drift with are mostly just wrong. Wrong for him, anyway. We know that none of them is going to be right for him visually because they're all pretty much identically dressed Asian dudes with similar haircuts. The variation is mostly, you know, in height. They've got no names and no Jaeger, and the movie doesn't really care about them, and so probably neither do we. But they're also there as an explanation of why it's hard to find Raleigh a drift partner. He's unpredictable. Raleigh's previous partner was his brother Yancey. They grew up together. They knew each other. I mean, the unpredictable becomes predictable when it's family. It wasn't a problem for Raleigh and Yancey to drift together, but these guys do not know Raleigh at all, and they don't really understand him either. Possibly what Mako thought was that he needed someone to rein him in because his previous tactical style was so unorthodox and brash. But actually, given the loss of his brother and the years he has spent avoiding the fight and the gentleness with which he responds to her basically saying, "I don't think you can cut it," gives us the clue that he doesn't need someone to tell him what to do. At this point, he's older and more experienced and less hot-headed. Note, I said less hot-headed. Everyone has a button you can push, and we'll get to that later. What he needs in the drift is not someone who can rein him in, it's someone who can keep up, and these three can't. So he fights.
It's a dialogue, not a fight.
Fine, he communicates via sticks with Mako's hand-picked candidates, only to communicate via beating with all of them. Now, in order to keep everything moving along, we only see the last point in the first three fights that Raleigh does. There's a definite theme that emerges. The choreography in the first match is brief, and most of what we see is Raleigh parrying. But when Raleigh goes in overhead and is parried, he jabs his staff under the parry, twists his opponent, gets him on the floor, and we're done. While everything is basic staff drills, guy number one is fine, but as soon as Raleigh does something slightly unorthodox, can't cope.
4 points to 0.
Guy number two loses 4 points to 1, and this initial piece of choreography is fairly standard staff drill stuff. High left, low left, high right, low left again, high right, and then Raleigh just barges him and he's on the floor. You see the theme emerging? As soon as Raleigh does something even slightly unexpected, like jabbing his staff under the guard instead of a sweeping strike, or body checking instead of fighting with the staff directly, his opponents can't anticipate and they can't recover. Guy number three is weirdly flashy for someone who's on his 6th match. You'd think they'd have stopped posturing by now, but you know what? You do you. Interestingly enough, they both start in a stance which says, I have a two-handed sword and so do you. Which is perfectly fine, but it's fascinating that Raleigh chooses to echo his partner here.
You could have taken all of them 2 moves earlier.
Well, yes, but maybe he's trying to feel that bond with them, Mako. Be reasonable. So they do some two-handed sword style work for a bit, but the way that Raleigh scores the point is, again, doing something unexpected, by using his staff in a very staff-like move as opposed to a sword-like one to flip this guy over. So then, having been dressed down by Mako on his performance, we let the young lady have a turn. Kick his butt, baby. I'll hold your clipboard. Now, Mako is smart, and presumably, unlike these guys, she has studied Raleigh and all of the missions he has ever been on.
Even Alaska.
She has also watched his last 14 bouts and become increasingly annoyed by the fact that he refuses to end the fight as soon as he can. He picks up on this, which is how they end up fighting, and immediately the tempo changes. When you learn fight choreography, you don't learn the entire thing in one go because that would be terrible and inefficient and your brain might explode. You learn it in sections, which around here we call phrases. I mean, you can call them what you like, but we call them phrases.
It's a dialogue, not a fight.
And also because of what he said. But, you know, sometimes it can be both. In these matches, the phrases are marked by a point being scored. And so the first phrase of the Raleigh-Mako fight is a bunch of posturing and 1 actual attack by Raleigh. 1 move to win is as short as you can get, and it signals to the audience that something different is happening, and you should pay attention. Mako stepping onto the mat is also when the music kicks in with, you know, a melody as opposed to just the sound of drumming, and so you're further cued in that something interesting is about to happen and you should pay attention. If these are conversations, then we start with the equivalent of, ready? And then a little pause before the response, yeah, I am. Now, was that last move a little bit cheeky on Mako's part because they hadn't officially reset? Maybe. Maybe not. Raleigh is happy to take advantage of it though. And note that he actually makes contact this time because, you know, it's her side and not her head.
Concentrate.
Are you flirting, Mr. Beckett? Huh. Alright, well, I'm paying attention. Having built up the tension with these very short exchanges where they're kind of feeling each other out, get your mind out of the gutter. You know, they're analysing, they're using their brains. It's not until the 4th phrase that we actually get into it properly. Note that this is the first time we get actual back and forth, and also that this is longer than any of the closing phrases in the previous fights. There's also a little bit of anticipation. I talked a little bit about anticipation in my last Jedi video, but it's one of those things that's quite hard to avoid when you're learning choreography, especially when fighting is not your specialty. Ideally, you are so practiced that you start moving after your partner starts attacking. I mean, that often doesn't happen, but when things are being played at full speed, you know, it's kind of hard to tell. That said, in this fight, anticipation is exactly what you want. The deeper the bond, the better you fight. The more you just kind of know what the other person's gonna do, like you're a Jedi or something. And the deeper the bond, the longer the phrases, because now you know how the other person thinks, you can counter them. Point to Mako after a bit, but it should be noted that nothing Raleigh does in this section is particularly unexpected. It's all relatively high target staff moves. It's a test. Kind of. The 5th phrase, he actively tries to throw her off a little bit by starting with a different grip, but it does not work. And in this phrase, it's Mako who does something unexpected when she rolls him to take the point. Then we time jump, probably for reasons of pacing, right into the middle of the 6th phrase, and it is on. Please note the variation, it's not all parries now. For example, Mako ducks under a high blow here to give us something a bit visually different, and note also the symmetry. This time it's Raleigh who does some unexpected throwing. And the last phrase is my favourite. It's fast and smooth and flowing and it moves. And it's different in character to the points before it, because this time, the unexpected moves don't throw them off. Mako ducks under Raleigh's staff again, but this time she moves around him. But he is expecting that and parries. Raleigh jabs his staff at her instead of swinging it and she avoids him. Mako goes for Raleigh's feet and he jumps over her, and it takes her tackling him to the ground before she scores the point. 3-4. Mako wins.
Enough!
The Ranger may have seen enough, but so has Raleigh.
She's my co-pilot.
Well, yes, and the choreography makes it obvious why, especially that last point, which is one of the reasons it's the longest one. Also for the tension building purposes. By this point they've already learned enough about each other that the unexpected move, which would usually have got them a point, has failed to work. They've been sparring for under 2 minutes and already the biggest problem that the previous guys had, that of Raleigh being unexpected, doesn't throw Mako off. She can not only adapt to it, she can win. It's also a great way to set up their partnership visually and technically. After all, he is the veteran and she is the rookie. Everything he does, she responds. He gets a single point move, she counters with 2 moves to even the score. He attacks, she counters. She attacks, he counters. The unexpected changes only work once. And once we get to this last point, the heck yes we're drift compatible point, the unexpected things don't work. Okay, fine, that one worked. But I bet in their next match it wouldn't. Further emphasizing this connection is the fact that she's comfortable enough to joke with him in the middle of the match.
Better watch it.
I mean, of course they're gonna go kick kaiju butt with cannons and a sword. Look at their adorable faces. And of course they're sparring, so it's not a real fight. As I said in my Captain Marvel video, when we know it's a sparring match and not a fight to the death, it's a very quick way to establish intimacy between two characters. Because they trust each other enough to hit each other with sticks and get all hot and sweaty while they're doing it. It doesn't establish that intimacy for the first 3 candidates because we see them once, briefly, being beaten, and they're never seen nor heard from again. But everything changes when Mako steps onto the mats. We change the tempo by having the first 3 points be more mental mind games than actual technique. As I mentioned previously, the music gets a melody to go along with the drumming, and that melody gets progressively more insistent as we go through the fight. The phrases get increasingly long because it's progressively more difficult for them to fool each other, and the fights get more beautiful and fluid and dance-like as they understand each other better and anticipate each other more. What they're trying to sell you on here is basically the concept of drift compatibility. They fight this well because they're friends, because they have a connection. You don't want to know how Raleigh fights with people he doesn't like.
But it is pretty cool. So I might tell you. I'm gonna tell you.
The Raleigh versus Chuck fight occurs after Raleigh and Mako's first disastrous drift attempt in which she nearly shoots everyone with a cannon. Chuck, who has spent the entire film being an antagonistic jerk to basically everyone, gets up in Raleigh's face. Note how Raleigh isn't even bothering to look at him at this point, and is a jerk. Being a jerk and fighting kaiju basically comprises 90% of Chuck's personality. Raleigh, who has so far responded to Chuck's provocation with precisely the level of interest that it deserves, i.e. basically none, calms Mako down when she gets angry on his behalf, but then Chuck insults Mako and it's on. There is basically no wind-up. Raleigh looks at Chuck, takes a breath, and punches him in the face. Raleigh and Chuck are not compatible at all, and we're about to demonstrate that, which is why everything is different. Their motivations are different. It's unsanctioned brawling rather than sparring, it's unarmed rather than having bow staffs. The music is more percussion and less melody. The camera work is generally closer in to emphasize the anger on their faces rather than how beautifully they're moving. And Chuck isn't expecting it, and this fight is vicious and not really very beautiful at all. It's kind of ugly. Raleigh lands 2 punches before Chuck manages to score 1, and from then on it's Raleigh's fight and Chuck doesn't really get a look in. We've spent some time in this movie setting up the fact that Chuck is a bully who tries and mostly fails to pick on Raleigh, and that he doesn't understand Raleigh. He doesn't understand what he thinks or what he values or what would actually hurt his feelings. He just kind of flails. If, as Raleigh says,
It's a dialogue, not a fight.
on the mats, then this is not so much a dialogue as a monologue that Chuck tries and mostly fails to interrupt. And that monologue reads, "How dare you insult my BFF, apologise or I'll smush your face." And so Raleigh goes to town. Punching, kicking, more punching, wall slamming, more wall slamming, symbolic steam, and Brazilian jiu-jitsu to finish it off, because why not? That last move is pretty much the nicest looking thing in the entire fight. Mako and Raleigh's fight is set up in every single way to emphasize their compatibility. It's an official sparring match for the purpose of finding someone compatible with Raleigh. There is a point system. They anticipate each other's moves, which, as I said previously, is pretty much inevitable in choreography, but in this case works to emphasize what's going on. There's back and forth in terms of who's attacking and who's defending. They recover quickly from unexpected moves that the other person makes, and they make unexpected moves themselves. There is a fluid, flowing quality to it that builds over the course of the match. They're trying to discover whether or not they're drift compatible. It's competitive, but it's also meant to be cooperative. The whole point of this match is to sell you on their compatibility. Physically, mentally, emotionally, everythingly, and so it looks nice. Chuck and Raleigh's fight is set up not just so you know they loathe each other, but also to underline visually both their personalities and all of the things Chuck does not understand. They don't gel visually because they don't gel spiritually, and it's like 2 dudes fighting in a bar. There's not a lot of finesse or tactics here, they just want to hurt each other. But one of them can still think when he's angry, and one of them can't. Want to take a wild guess which one's which? Physically, Chuck is overwhelmed by Raleigh's skills. Chuck has mistaken passive responses to his bullying for weakness, but it's not. So he's off guard initially and then off balance for a significant section of this relatively short fight. Emotionally, Chuck is in the same state that he's always in. Angry, quarrelsome, sarcastic, scared. He's never seen Raleigh angry on behalf of someone he cares about before. I'd be scared too, honestly. And Chuck can't appropriately respond to that because the only thing he knows how to express love and care for is his dog. Stacker Pentecost is Pacific Rim's closest equivalent to Mary Sue, so he can drift with anyone.
I carry nothing into the drift.
For no apparent reason, including very angry Chuck, but that's clearly never going to be true of Raleigh. In this instance, they are speaking the same kind of language, which is to say, the language of rage, but Raleigh's anger is usually well-contained, focused, meaningful. Chuck is just kind of angry at the world, and so the idea of being mad on someone else's behalf doesn't really occur to him. I mean, if he understood how to deal with his anger, they wouldn't be fighting, would they? It's not a sparring match between two opponents testing their skill on each other. It's, you know, a bar fight, albeit carried out by two guys with a higher level of skill than you would normally find in a bar, and also not actually located in a bar. Fine, it's not very much like a bar fight, but you take my point. Raleigh is one guy, and these are two fights, or I guess technically 5 fights, but the contrast in them is pretty stark. In the first 3, he looks for understanding but doesn't find it. In the last one, the only understanding he wants is the understanding that if you say mean things about Mako, you apologize or I beat your face. And in the 4th one, he finds everything he's looking for. Don't you love it? I love it. For another look at how phrases shape fight scenes, I recommend my Witcher video. Or if you'd rather talk about the character clues that one can glean from Sparring, then maybe my Veers Yonrog Captain Marvel video is the one for you. Either way, thank you for watching, thanks to my patrons, and I'll see you next time.